Okay, hello everyone. My name is Peter Giuliano. I'm the Chief Research Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association and the Executive Director of the Coffee Science Foundation. And it's my pleasure to host this lecture. And the very first thing I want to do is thank Pacific Barista Series for sponsoring this expo lecture series and allowing us to do this great thing. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce this speaker because we've been working together a lot on coffee research. Bill is going to share with you his research at UC Davis that is a part of the Specialty Coffee Association and Coffee Science Foundation's research initiative that we've been doing for the last 3 years. So I won't say any more. I'll let Bill continue. But anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bill Ristenpart from the Department of Chemical Engineering at UC Davis and the director of the UC Davis Coffee Center. Welcome, Bill. Oh,
Thank you, Peter.
I should mention questions. We'll have questions and answers at the end of Bill's lecture. So you can go ahead and type the questions in, and then I'll be asking Bill those questions at the end. So great. Thanks, Bill. Take it away.
No, thank you. And thank you to Pacific for sponsoring this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been doing about coffee at the UC Davis Coffee Center. And so as you can see here, the title of this talk is Towards a New Coffee Brewing Control Chart. And as we go over the next hour or so, I'm going to help build you up to what our current understanding is of the best ways to, we think, improve our understanding of coffee brewing using the classic coffee brewing control chart. So in terms of an outline, what I thought I'd do is just take this opportunity to do a couple things. And the first and by far shorter part of my presentation will be to share a little bit about the UC Davis Coffee Center. Some of you have heard about it, some of you might not have, and I'll give an update as to where we are with the Coffee Center. And then the other 90% of the talk is part two. And like I said, it's going to be building up towards our current understanding of coffee brewing. So first, part one. And so some of you might not know about UC Davis. Very briefly, it's part of the University of California system. There are many schools. There's UC Berkeley, UCLA. UC Davis is pretty close to Napa Valley in the center of the state. We have almost 30,000 undergraduates when there's not a global pandemic. Lots of bicycles. This is what it looks like most of the time, and hopefully we'll get back to that soon. What I'd like to point out is that there are several UC campuses, but only UC Davis has departments focused on food science. And one of the most famous ones is the Robert Mondavi Institute. This houses the departments of food science and technology and viticulture and enology. That's making grapes and growing grapes and making wine. Okay. World-class facilities. Okay. And one of the reasons I point that out is that even though we have a long history in grapes and in wine stuff, there's not much history in coffee. Okay. And to make a long story short about why that is basically because coffee is not grown here in the United States to any appreciable extent. And so Peter mentioned I'm a chemical engineer. I got into coffee a few years ago now as a pedagogical exercise to teach people about engineering and about science using coffee. And so without spending too much time on the details, I made a class called The Design of Coffee. Again, when there's not a pandemic, we teach about 2,000 students per year go through our class. And we talk about a lot of things that people in coffee are very interested in, including mass transfer, conservation of mass, energy usage, colloids, lots of cool things that we do there. And Peter also mentioned our long UC Davis's connection to UC Davis. We developed this class, gosh, around 2013 or so, and very quickly, Peter and Rick Reinhardt and a bunch of other Specialty Coffee Association folks came and visited Davis, and it really started a fruitful collaboration. And one thing led to another, and pretty soon we were making connections. It very quickly became clear that not only was there a big need for teaching of coffee, but also for research. And so here's a very brief timeline of the Coffee Center. My colleagues and I kind of got kickstarted around 2013. We renovated an undergraduate coffee lab. In 2016, we received a founding gift from Pete's Coffee for a full-fledged coffee center. And since then, many different entities, many of which are listed down there, have come together and very generously donated to help support the UC Davis Coffee Center. And so the excitement that really got triggered in 2016 was the idea of an actual physical building for the Coffee Center. And so here on the left, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but over here on the left, we have a picture of the coffee center. It's an existing building. And what we've been doing is raising funds to renovate it into a dedicated facility for world-class education and cutting-edge research focused on coffee. And I've been very excited about it. And so very briefly, I'll show you, we finished architectural renderings. So the idea is to make it a place for everybody in the global coffee community to be able to come and visit and do research and learn about coffee. And so these pictures are all available online. You can see we have lots of beautiful pictures of the renderings, including this is one for a sensory descriptive lab. Okay, and if there are any independently wealthy individuals watching and want to have their name up in the coffee center, please email me or ask a question in the chat. Okay, and so in terms of the structure of the building, again, we're designed to have everything under one roof that you need for coffee research and education, including a green bean storage laboratory, lots of unanswered questions about the chemical and biological degradation mechanisms that affect coffee. Here's the Pete's Coffee Pilot Roastery. Okay, the La Marzocco Brewing and Espresso Laboratory. La Marzocco is a very generous sponsor. They've helped name the Brewing and Espresso Laboratory. Over here on the bottom, we have the Toddy Innovation Lab. Okay, we're very excited that we're kickstarting some new research on cold brew in collaboration with Toddy. Wasson Classroom, whole bunch of different things here. And green are opportunities for naming still. Okay, we also hired a full-time lab manager. So Juliet just started last fall. Juliet Hahn, she was at Blue Bottle. We scooped her away, and now she's our head roaster and Probot roasting fellow based on a very generous philanthropic donation from Probot. And so what I'd like to emphasize is that today I'm going to be talking about coffee brewing in great detail. I'm a chemical engineer, I'll be focusing on it from that point of view. But UC Davis has a very deep bench of professors of expertise from all over campus, okay, ranging from plant genetics and plant science all the ways down to the consumer science and sensory science. And you can see there's lots of different people here. And then there's lots of examples of research as well. So kind of covered up here on the top left-hand side, you can see, hopefully you can make out the coffee taster's flavor wheel. The statistics underlying that were actually the effort of a grad student at UC Davis, Molly Spencer, and she got her work published on the cover of the Journal of Food Science, which is great. And there's lots of different things going on here. And I like this slide to just really drive home that when you hear when you read news reports about research being done somewhere, typically is done by students. And that's one of the best things about the university system is it really is an academic talent pipeline. And what we're trying to do is create one for the coffee industry. And so we also have some collaborations with World Coffee Research, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to fly through that quickly. Lots of things cooking at the UC Davis Coffee Center with regard to coffee. So right now, what I'd like to do is, that was just a brief overview of where we're at with Coffee Center at UC Davis. Now let's turn gears, or switch gears, and turn towards a new coffee brewing control chart. And so first off, I love this slide. I want to give a little bit of historical perspective. Okay. So some of you who've studied the coffee brewing control chart that we're building up towards might have heard this name before, Ernest Earl Lockhart. He was a explorer of Antarctica before World War II, and later on he became the director of something called the Coffee Brewing Institute, and he actually studied chemistry at MIT. Okay? And so he was one of the early pioneers for coffee research. And I love this little article here. This is from 1958. The title of this article is Coffee Needs Research. Okay, and I think that statement is as true now, or even more so now than it was more than half a century ago. And if maybe you can make out some of the questions here. Here's up in the top right-hand side, here's a question. How should the beverage be prepared to give the best flavor? Okay, why does the flavor of beverage change on standing, and what can be done about it? Why does water from different parts of the country make the beverage taste differently, and what can be done about it? So very excellent questions. People were curious about these things in the 50s, and if you've paid attention to recent research, people are still wondering about these and doing research on that right now. And so one of the questions we're addressing right now today is our first question, is how should the beverage be prepared to give the best flavor? And so Lockhart had some insight onto this. And so in 1957, he wrote what's in coffee science kind of a seminal paper. And the title of that was The Soluble Solids in Beverage Coffee as an Index to Cup Quality. So as an index, what does he mean by that? He means a number. Can we use a simple measurement to say something about the quality of the coffee? Okay, and this was such a new idea at the time that it quickly spread around. There's a picture of Ted Lingle. He was one of the first directors of the Specialty Coffee Association, and he compiled a lot of the information that Lockhart developed and the Coffee Brewing Institute put together, and compiled it into the Coffee Brewing Handbook, which my understanding is still the #1 selling book that the SCA sells. And if you flip open the Brewing Handbook and look inside, you'll see the coffee brewing control chart. Okay, and so what you're seeing here on the slide are 3 different representations of exactly the same thing. And so focusing here, I'm not sure if you guys, I'm having a hard time getting. Can you hear me now?
Hey, yeah, we can hear you now. I think you
Okay.
dropped off for a second.
I'm not sure what happened. Okay. Where did I cut off? Well, I'll just go through the slide again. So anyways, are we good to go now?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay. Sorry for that delay. I'm not sure what's going on. The coffee brewing control chart, this is what we're looking at right here. And so this is a reminder for those of you who are familiar with it, and as an introduction for those of you who haven't seen it before, this shows the strength on the vertical axis. That's what I mean, the strength, that's the concentration, that's how much stuff is in your cup of coffee. And the horizontal axis is the extraction, or also known as the solubles yield, or percent extraction. And that's how much you ripped out of the coffee grounds into the liquid phase. And superimposed on the chart are different diagonal lines, and those represent different brew ratios, which we'll talk about in a second. And then probably the most important thing is that it has these sensory descriptors superimposed. And so if you can read this over here on the top left, it says strong, underdeveloped. Over here on the top right, it says strong, bitter. Then down here, it's weak, bitter, weak, underdeveloped. And in the very middle, it says ideal, optimum, balance. Okay? And so this was kind of Lockhart's idea. He thought that you could take this index, you could take this brew strength, and map the sensory qualities and the consumer preferences and what's the best coffee onto that number, that measurement. And so what I'd like to spend a couple minutes here to say, like, well, where do these numbers come from? Okay, so I think a lot of people don't have a good understanding of where those numbers come from. And so just very briefly, I'll drop into chemical engineering mode and just give a quick demonstration of the principle of conservation of mass. And the basic idea, just in a nutshell, is that like we can keep track of how much mass we put in to our brewer and how much comes out. And so, for example, we can measure very easily how much mass we put into a brewer. And here I have a picture of a Mr. Coffee, but this applies to any type of brewer. Okay, so we know the mass. That's the blue arrow on the way in. And we know that however much water we put in has to equal how much water comes out. And in any type of brewing apparatus, you have at least 3 different material streams where water leaves. And so the first one is obviously the coffee that you drink. Okay, there's the beverage. There's a lot of water there. Sometimes you see steam escaping. Okay, so there's water escaping up into the air. And then you have water in the spent moist grounds. You know, they came in dry, they exit moist, they have water. And so if you put this in terms of an equation down here at the bottom, what you can say then is that the mass of the water in has to equal the mass of the water out. Even more mathematically, the mass of the feed water that you put in has to equal the sum of the masses of water in those other three streams. And so that's not a very useful equation. And so what we have to do is make some simplifications. And here on the top, the first thing we do is we assume that the amount of steam is negligibly small, which is true for most brewing techniques, as long as you're not boiling the water vigorously. Okay? So we just cross that term out. The second assumption is for simplicity, we just note that a cup of coffee is about 99% water. And so we approximate the mass of the water in the brew as the mass of the brew itself. And then we have to make a third assumption about how much water is in the spent moist grounds. And so we can make an analogy to paper towels. Okay. And so when you brew, what are you doing? You're dripping water onto a porous material. And so if you do a thought experiment where you take some paper towels and hold them under a leaky faucet, what's going to happen? You first catch those water drops in the paper towel. The water absorbs into the paper towel. Okay. And if you keep holding there, eventually what happens, the paper towel fills up and then water starts dripping through again. And so you can describe that effect mathematically. Here I have the expression R sub abs, that's the absorption ratio. And that's the mass of absorbed water per mass of dry paper towels. Okay. You can do the same thing for coffee. Coffee is exactly like paper towels in this regard. You can absorb so much water in the coffee grounds per mass of dry coffee grounds. So if you put in more coffee grounds, you're going to absorb more water. And so if you then combine that into our mass balance, and there's an animation here that didn't pop up, but the basic idea is you insert this absorption ratio, which is also known as a liquid retention ratio in some circles. You insert that in your mass balance, and very quickly what you get is this very useful equation that predicts how much coffee are you going to get when you make a batch of coffee. And basically what it says is that how much brew you get is equal to how much water you feed in minus something. And that something is proportional to the mass of the coffee grounds and this absorption ratio, which depending on the brewing technique and the coffee grind size is roughly about 2. Okay. Lockhart's implicit value was 2.168. Okay. And so a real important take-home message is, hopefully this is intuitive. If you put in 300 grams of water into a brewer, you're not going to get 300 grams of coffee. You lose some to the coffee grounds. So what does this have to do with the coffee brewing control chart? Well, this definition gets inserted into it. And so to see that, we have to start, we have to define our two metrics again here. So I already mentioned this, but just to drive it home, we're going to be talking about these a lot. The two key metrics for coffee brewing are this extraction yield or percent extraction. And that, again, that's how much of the mass did you rip out of the coffee grounds into the liquid phase. Coffee grounds are at most roughly 30% soluble. Okay. And that was one of Lockhart's big insights, is that like you don't want to extract all the way to 30%. Typically, you want to have something closer to 20%. And the other metric is the total dissolved solids, or TDS, and that's how much is in your cup of coffee. Okay? And so, roughly speaking, that's 1 to 2%. And so, if we do a similar mass balance, I led you guys through a mass balance on water. If we do a mass balance on the coffee grounds, you get a very important relationship. And so here, very quickly, if you take this blue box over here on the left, that's the mass of the dry coffee grounds. And then over here, where does the solid coffee exit the brewer? It's in two different places. It's in the spent moist grounds. Okay, here on top, that's the green box. And that's basically related to everything that wasn't extracted. So it's 1 minus the percent extraction there. And then there's this red box down here, and that's the actual mass of dissolved solids in the coffee. And so if you just put those together and do a little algebra, you get this gray box equation down here. And you see that the percent extraction, how much you extracted out of the coffee, is linearly proportional to your TDS. Okay? And it's also proportional to the mass of the brew, which we just solved for a second ago with our paper towel analogy. So if we combine those two things, okay, and I'm going quickly through the algebra here, but you can just trust me that this is correct. You get down to this orange box down here on the bottom, okay, which says that the percent extraction is equal to the TDS times the difference of your brew ratio. That's how much water, how much grams of water per grams of coffee grounds you put in, minus the absorption ratio. Okay, and if you recall, I mentioned that the diagonal lines on the coffee brewing control chart here to the left, those are basically defined by this equation right here. Okay, so each of the brew ratios that are listed there, the actual line, the slope of that line, depends on that brew ratio and the absorption ratio. Okay, and so that's a quick overview of percent extraction and TDS and the brew ratio. Okay, the most important thing, I think, for many people, especially coffee community, is how does the coffee taste? Okay, and so everything I just talked about from kind of an engineering point of view doesn't say very much about the sensory descriptors that are superimposed on the coffee brewing control chart. Okay, and so what I'd like to do, without beating up on it too much, is just to point out that as insightful as this work was in the 1950s, this approach for the coffee brewing control chart is a bit problematic from a modern sensory science perspective. And so there's a few problems. The very first one is that the chart conflates, it mixes up sensory descriptive judgments, okay, which is like, that basically means what does it taste like? Is it bitter or is it not bitter? Okay, and it conflates those with hedonic sensory judgments. What do people like the most? Okay, and so in modern sensory science, you don't do those. Those are two different things. Okay, the way that things are lined up here, you have this kind of this blue dashed line, the vertical line. You have these sharp lines that kind of suggest that there's huge differences, with minor differences in either percent extraction or TDS. And that's not really true. It's very difficult to judge a 17.9% extraction versus 18.1% extraction. Okay. And then probably most importantly, the consumer, consumer basis now in 2020, very different from the 1950s. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with 1950s housewives, but like this, tastes were different, styles were different. What people were looking for in a cup of coffee was different. Okay. And so these criticisms are not unique to us. I think a lot of thought leaders in the coffee industry have thought about this for a while. But in our discussions with the Specialty Coffee Science, with the Specialty Coffee Association, and then later, which spun out the Coffee Science Foundation, we decided that it was time to tackle the coffee brewing control chart. And so in 2017, the Coffee Center started collaborating with the Coffee Science Foundation, with underwriting support from Breville Corporation, which manufactures really cool coffee brewers. Okay. And what was our goal? Our goal was basically to update and expand and modernize the coffee brewing control chart. Okay. And so I don't have time to go into it today, but I'll just highlight a couple different things here. We've already published a couple, I think, very cool publications that have come out of this. So here on the left, I talked about this at Expo in person, not online, last year. This is some work looking at the effect of basket geometry. Okay, so whether you have a flat bottom or a conical filter basket. Okay, and it turns out that when you hold everything else constant, you actually do get a pretty significant difference. We got some really intriguing consumer preference data and sensory descriptive data based on just changing the basket geometry, holding everything else constant. And so you can either look at it actually got published on the cover of the Journal of Food Science, which was great for Scott. That's a plain English article in the SCA 25 magazine titled Flat versus Cone. On the right-hand side, we have more recent work. This is by Kenzie Batali. And she was basically looking at fractionating coffee, okay, and doing really detailed sensory descriptive work on what each fraction, what do the first 30 seconds of coffee taste like compared to the next 30 seconds, compared to the next 30 seconds. And we found that a lot of sensory qualities decreased, as it got less strong, like bitterness and sourness. And surprisingly, some increased, like sweetness. Okay, so a lot of specialty coffee people are really eager to maximize the sweetness in their black coffee. Okay, and so here we have some really hard data on that. So I urge you to look at that. It came out a couple months ago in the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture. And we also have a plain English article in the SCA 25 magazine called Less Strong, More Sweet. So what I'd like to focus on here, though, is some of our work on the coffee brewing control chart directly. Okay, and so, and very specifically, we had some research objectives. Okay? And the first question we have, okay, was how do specific sensory attributes change in respect to the brewing control chart? Okay, and so here on the bottom on the left, you can see a mini view of the coffee taster's flavor wheel. I'm sure many of you have seen this. There's about 100 different flavor descriptors on there, including kind of obvious ones and then pretty obscure ones as well. But they're all flavors that have been detected in brewed coffee. Okay, and if you think about the coffee brewing control chart, it's only got 2 or 3 descriptors on it. Okay, so there's a big mismatch. And so one of our first questions is how do specific sensory attributes, like the ones you can find on the coffee taster's flavor wheel, how do they change with the brewing conditions? Okay. A couple other questions here, which I'm not going to talk about today because we have 2 more seminars in the next 2 days, I will focus on these in detail, are how important is brew temperature? Okay, you can imagine if you're a coffee brewer manufacturer or a barista doing pour overs with a kettle, that's a really important question, right? And so we have a whole talk on Saturday focused on that question. How does a brew temperature affect these things? And then the third question is, what brews do people like the most? Okay, and so you can see on the classic coffee brew control chart, there's a big square right in the middle. It says ideal, right? And that really raises the question, ideal for who? Okay, and so we actually now have some really, really awesome data answering or addressing the issue of consumer hedonic preferences. Okay, not what does it taste like, but what do you like? Okay, and so there's a talk tomorrow by Andrew Cotter about that. So right here, I'm going to be focusing on the first question, which is how do the specific sensory attributes change with respect to brewing conditions? Okay. And so here's our experimental design. Okay, and I should emphasize that this is all work that was led by Dr. Scott Frost, who is a postdoc in our group. He's now up in Washington State at a different university. He got scooped away. But here's our experimental design. Okay, and so here's a representation of our coffee brewing control chart. Okay, and again on the vertical axis is the strength, on the horizontal axis is extraction. Okay, and what we wanted to do was have a certain number of target brews, and we wanted to bracket the whole coffee brewing control chart. So each of these red circles kind of represents a target brew condition. And you can see we have 3 levels of TDS, 3 levels of percent extraction. And what we want to do is make sure that whatever results we get are valid for at least a few different types of coffee. So what we did was we used 3 pretty wildly different roast levels, which are light, medium, and dark. Okay, we used a representative wet washed Arabica that was donated by Royal Coffee. Okay. And so that was our approach. Okay. And so the very first thing we have to do is make sure that we can use a drip coffee brewer to make those brews reproducibly. And so one of our donors is Curtis, and so they very kindly donated a whole bunch of Curtis G4 brewers. Okay, and one of the nice things about these is that they have something that you can customize in terms of their water pulsing duty cycle. So when you're pouring or doing a pour over, you can control the rate at which you pour coffee into it. These guys have pumps inside them, so you can specifically control how quickly you deliver the water and the flow rate and the duty cycle. Okay, and so what do I mean by that? That's a very engineering term. And you can basically think about it. A duty cycle is the ratio of time that the water is on, the pump is on, okay, versus the time it's off. Okay, and so you can have different duty cycles. Okay, so here on the top, there's a 50% duty cycle. These are all 50% duty cycles here down the middle. Okay, well, you can have different numbers of cycles. And then over here on the right, you can see here's different percentage duty cycles. And I won't go into detail on the equations, but basically you can relate the duty cycle, how long the water is flowing, okay, and the flow rate to how much water actually goes through. Long story short, we can use this approach and really dial in whatever TDS and percent extraction we want along a given diagonal of the coffee brewing control chart. So what you're looking at here is actual experimental data with our Curtis brewers, okay? And the different colors here represent different duty cycles, and the different shapes represent different number of cycles. And so you can see that over here at the pink, I guess you can't see where I'm pointing my mouse, but the pink on the bottom left, those were 100% duty cycle, and that corresponds to just flowing all the water through as quickly as possible, and then it's done, okay? And that gives you a pretty low TDS and a pretty low extraction, essentially just because the total brew time is short. And at the opposite extreme, up in the top right, you have these 10 cycles and very small, the more kind of orangish yellowish ones. That's where you have the water on just for a very short amount of time, and then it's just sitting for a long time. And so the water is just sitting in the brew basket, extracting, and then you have another pulse and it comes through. You effectively have a much longer brew time, and you can get up to these higher extractions. So this is, I don't know how many brews here. There's a whole bunch right there. If you want to move up or down, okay, what you have to do is switch the brew ratio. Okay, so here I have it expressed in terms of grams per liter. Okay, and these are averages. Okay, and so if you want to move up or down in the brews in the coffee brew control chart, you can change a whole bunch of things. You can change the brew ratio. You can change your duty cycle, and if necessary, you can also change your grind size to change how quickly the water drains through the coffee grounds. Okay? And so we figured out how to do all that. Okay? And once we did, we were able to pretty good approximation, nail all of our target brews. Okay? So those previous couple slides were preliminary data. These are the actual coffees that our expert panel, which I'll describe in a second, actually tasted. Okay, and so there are 243 data points up here, which means that Scott did 243 brews live for his expert panel to taste things. And the different colors here represent the different targets. Okay, and you can see that there's some scatter. Right, it's very difficult to hit. Anybody who brews coffee for a living knows it's very difficult to hit exactly the same thing every single time, especially with drip brew, because you have channeling. The water always follows the path of least resistance. Okay, but the standard deviation, or the error in each target brew, is small compared to the differences between brews. So Scott did a really good job of hitting these targets. So those are the coffees. That's what we brewed. Okay, and again, what we're trying to do is answer the question: what do these things taste like? Okay, and so the approach we use at the coffee center is kind of different from the standard cupping table and Q certified tasters and things like that. What we do at the coffee center at Davis is we use sensory description isolation booths. So here on the bottom left, you can see some pictures. There's like little doors that open up. And what you do is you have your panelists in isolation booths. There's one booth per panelist. Okay. You have a red light on, so you can't even really see the coffee very clearly. There's a positive pressure displacement. So it's a very controlled environment. So where you try to minimize context bias. You don't want to see somebody else grimacing or laughing because they enjoy the coffee. And you also minimize expectation bias, because if you see coffee that looks stronger, okay, you'll judge it as being stronger regardless of whether it is or not. Okay? So we use this approach, okay, and we set up a panel, an expert panel, to do descriptive analysis. Okay, and so here on the left you can see part of our panel doing some calibration experiments. Okay, and here the kind of 4 standard steps in descriptive analysis. First one is defining a product set, and what we're looking for here, there's no absolute like bitterness score, for example. There's no universally accepted one. What we do is calibrate the panel with respect to references, and we're looking for relative scores. Okay, and so what we do is we have different references, and you can see a few of them down here: tobacco, whiskey, rubber. Okay, and we basically spend a lot of time, even more time, calibrating and setting up the references than we do actually doing the experiments, because we have to try to get everybody to agree on, like, oh, this aroma means rubber. Okay, this level of bitterness is what we mean by 50% bitter. Okay, and so we also tasted the coffee, and they do attribute generation. There's about 100 different terms on the coffee taster's flavor wheel. We can't do all of them, but based on what the panel detects, okay, we ended up with a subset of about 30 of the ones that were most prominent in the coffee that we tasted over the 3 different roast levels. Okay, and so here's that list. You can see a whole bunch of cool attributes. Gosh, floral, smoke, berry, dried fruit, whiskey. That's one of my favorites. Okay, all the ways down to other things that you don't like. Perhaps like rubber and things like that. And in the middle column here, that's some of our reference standards. So in terms of the descriptive analysis service, we had 12 members of our panel. They all tasted blind. They have no idea what they're tasting. They do 3 trial replicates. Okay, so that's why we had to do so many brews. Okay, so that we can have everybody taste everything blind in triplicate. They tasted about 30 different tastes, or they judged about 30 different taste and aroma attributes. Okay, and everything's in random. Okay, and we also took care to make sure that all the coffees were actually served at the same temperature. Okay, which was about 65 degrees Celsius. So in the background here is representative raw descriptive analysis data. So each row is one judge tasting one coffee and giving a numerical score, okay, for one attribute. And so this is maybe 1 or 2% of our entire data set. It's an enormous data set, okay, because they tasted all these different coffees, 27 different sample types, right? That's 3 TDS, 3 PE, 3 roast levels in triplicate, okay. And so and 30 different attributes. So there's just a tremendous amount of data. And so we have to choose some ways of representing these data. Okay? And so here I'm going to highlight, there's lots of ways to do it. I'm going to highlight 3 different ways here. One is to look at the what we call the univariate trends. Okay, and you'll see what that means in a second. And then principal components analysis, how are the different sample types related to each other? And then probably of most interest is something called response surface methodology, which is kind of like a contour map, and that's the thing that'll look most like the coffee brewing control chart. And so first, the univariate response, okay? And so what you're looking at here are plots of the attribute intensity, okay? So a higher score, okay, it means that it was more intense, okay? Versus the different conditions. So along the bottom, you can see either light, medium, or dark roast, or 1 or 1.25 or 1.5% TDS, or the 16, 20, or 24% extraction, okay? And then on the right-hand side, along the column there, you have the different flavor attributes. So of the 30 that we tasted or tested for, only about 17 or so yielded statistically significant differences. And so there's one here that's highlighted in red or orange, okay? And that's sourness. And so just to walk you through that, okay? Here you can see the different letters, the A, B, C, those denote statistical significantly different or not. So if two different columns have the same letter, that means there's no statistical significant difference between them. If they have different letters, then they are statistically significantly different. And so if you look at sourness and you look at roast, this will not be surprising to any coffee experts tuning in, okay? The light roast was the most sour, the medium roast was intermediate, and then the dark roast, the green one, that was the least sour, okay? So that's not surprising, okay? You roast things differently, you get different attributes. Now, if you hold kind of the roast constant, all right, this is the univariate response, then you can see the middle columns here, TDS, you can see that as the total dissolved solids goes up, it becomes more sour, okay? So that yellow column there is the highest. And then with percent extraction, you also see something similar. The higher the extraction, the lower sourness. And then you can look, there's a lot of data on here, so you can look at any attribute that you happen to be interested in. If it's blank, that means there was no statistical significant difference. So there are some things, quite a few actually, that depended on the roast level, okay, but didn't vary significantly with TDS or with PE. So this is one way of looking at it. Okay. Another way of looking at it, okay, is through something called principal component analysis. Okay, and so because there's so many different types of data here, so many different variables, what we can do is look for the relative relationships between the different products. Okay, and so the axes here don't have any prescribed physical meaning. Okay, it's really, we're looking for differences. And so here on the far right-hand side, this is just a generic example. We might have two samples, sample 1 and sample 3. They're located right next to each other. That means that there were no big differences between those two. And then way over on the other side is sample 2, okay? That was diametrically opposed to sample 1 and 3. It was very different from them, okay? And then sample 4 was different from both sample 2 and samples 1 and 3. It's there down at the bottom, okay? And then those are the actual product types, okay? You can also superimpose the loadings or the drivers, okay? And so here in this generic example, you can see sample 1 and sample 3 were characterized more by fruity flavor, sample 2 by burnt, sample 4 by chocolate, okay? And so that's how you read a PCA plot. So this is a generic example. Here's what it looks like, okay? Oh, sorry, here's our code, okay? And so in the next few plots, the first letter stands for the roast level, the middle number is the TDS, the last number is the percent extraction. That's our code here. So here's what it looks like in terms of data. Okay, here's our PCA plot on the left, and you can see right immediately that there's some trends. Okay, the color shading kind of indicates the roast level. On the far right side, you can see the loadings that correspond to this. And so just to zoom into this a bit more, because it's kind of hard to read at this scale, here's the left-hand plot plotted another way. And what I'll point out is that it might be hard at a glance to see these things, but I'll tell you the main trend here, which is that all the dark roasts end up on the far right side, okay? The medium roasts are kind of along the middle, and then the light roasts are on the left, okay? So not surprisingly, again, we had different roasts, and we got clear separation by roast, okay? It would have been a problem if we hadn't gotten that, okay? So that's the first separation. The second key trend here is the effect of TDS. And you can see here, this is kind of orthogonal to the roast level. All the 1% TDS, the low TDS values are in the bottom, okay? The 1.25s are in the middle, and the 1.5s, the high TDS, are along the top, okay? So we also have very clear separation due to the brew strength, the TDS. And then finally, we can look at the percent extraction. And if you stare at this hard enough, you can see that there's a little bit of variation with respect to percent extraction, but it's a little bit more challenging to see in this representation. And then finally, back to the drivers. So again, here's that plot. We can now start looking for trends, okay? And so remember on the PCA plot, the top left was characterized by light roasts and higher TDSs up along, at least along the middle there, okay? And here you can see that in this corner on the drivers here, sourness and citrus are predominate there, okay? And then in the opposite corner, okay, down to the bottom right, you can see things like earthy, roasted burnt wood ash. Okay, those were characterized by the higher extractions, okay, and the lower TDS is down in that corner. So that was two of the three ways to look at it, and this is still a little bit abstract. And so what we'd like to do now is, how do we like break this down into a really concrete way, okay? And the way we do that is kind of analogous to a standard contour map. And so one of the students who put this together was Andrew Cotter. He's from Pennsylvania, so he put a map of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, okay? And there, the color represents altitude. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh, it's a beautiful city, okay? It's on the river, but it's surrounded by tall hills, okay? So the hills are red, the river there is blue, okay? There's San Francisco if you're more of a West Coast person. The idea, what we'd like to do is take and map our attribute intensity, much like you would for altitude for a contour map, but map our attribute intensity onto the classic coffee brewing control chart, okay? And so there's a fancy term for that in sensory science. It's called response surface methodology. But what that really means is just instead of fitting a line through data points, you're fitting a plane or a curved surface through a 3D cloud of data points, okay? And so here's a generic example, okay? So you can imagine that the horizontal axis is extraction, the axis going into the screen is total dissolved solids, and then the vertical axis is attribute intensity. And on the left is some make-believe data points. On the right is the corresponding plane or curved surface that fits through it, okay? And so so we use this approach, we use this RSM approach, and here are a few examples of what you observe, okay? And so here what you're looking at is total dissolved solids versus percent extraction, okay? And on the left is light roast, and then medium roast, and then dark roast. And the colors here are proportional, like on our contour map, to the attribute intensity. So focusing on the light roast here on the left, okay, you can see in the top left corner of this plot, okay, there's an attribute intensity of 50, and then this fit, it was a planar fit, it went down, okay, towards the bottom right corner where it hit about 24, okay? And so in other words, if you had a low extraction, high TDS brew for this light roast, that's how you maximize your sourness. It was up in the top left corner. And if you, in the opposite, if you did a high percent extraction and a low TDS, then that's how you had minimal sourness. A similar trend was seen for the medium roast. And then for the dark roast, you can see that there's a more complicated shape. We have, instead of a kind of a straight plane, we have a curved plane, okay? But at the same kind of trend, you maximize the sourness up on that top left corner of the graph. And the corresponding 3D plots are down below. So that's sourness, that's one attribute. And we have maps like this for every attribute. I'm not going to go through all of them. Here's another one, bitterness, which behaves in the opposite direction, okay? So here now, bitterness, again, focusing on the left plot, here that's the light roast. You can see bitterness is maximized up in the top right corner, okay? That's where I hit an intensity value of 40, okay? And then the bitterness was least intense in the bottom left corner. So again, if you want to maximize bitterness with that roast, you want to go to as high an extraction and as high as TDS as you can. Okay? The medium roast had a more complicated shape again, but again, it was maximized up in the top right corner, and same with the dark roast. So one more example, okay? Sweetness, I mentioned that earlier, okay? It turned out that sweetness has a very different trend, at least with these three roasts of the coffee that we did. And so I'll focus on the far right side. That was our dark roast. And this had the opposite trend of the bitterness. So in the top right corner, sweetness was actually minimized, okay? And if you wanted to maximize sweetness, you had to go to a low TDS. And so I mentioned Kenzie's paper earlier when we fractionated coffee. It turned out if you want to maximize sweetness, you need to go to low values of TDS. very consistent with this observation we're seeing here. And so regardless of roast level, we saw that sweetness increased, okay, as TDS went down. Okay, and so we have a lot of data here, okay? And so here's one summary of the data. These are all the RSMs, the contour maps that varied, okay? And you can see we have plots for burnt wood ash flavor, citrus flavor, which was highly correlated with sourness. Here's bitterness again. Thickness is our word for body or for viscosity. Over here on the right, you might be able to see it. Some of the attributes varied significantly for some of the roasts, but not others, okay? These 7 here on the screen varied for all 3 roasts. Okay? And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that you already kind of saw a hint of this with sourness, sweetness, and bitterness, is that regardless of the roast level, we saw trends that were conserved. And so when we tasted these coffees, these coffees were very different roast levels. They tasted very differently. How they responded to TDS and percent extraction turns out to be pretty highly conserved for some attributes. And by that, I mean they behave the same, okay? So we can slice the data another way, okay? And we can average over roast level, okay? And so just pretend they're all the same and just ask what happens, okay? And we get, it turns out, 13 attributes of the 30 that were tested that are statistically significant. And I really wish I could draw right now. I'm having problems drawing. But what you can see is that on this graph, there are 4, okay, that are maximized in the top left corner. That's sourness, citrus flavor, fermented flavor, and dried fruit flavor. Those, if you want to maximize the citrus and sourness, you want to go to that top left corner. You want to maximize the TDS and minimize your extraction. Okay. In contrast, there's 8 attributes on here: astringency, bitterness, roasted flavor, rubber, burnt wood ash flavor, persistence, thickness, earthy flavor, that are maximized in the top right corner. So there you just want to max everything out. You want to increase the TDS, you want to increase the percent extraction, go to that top right corner. That's how you maximize it. And then, like I already pointed out for sweetness, there's one attribute, okay, that regardless of roast level, you want to go to low TDS values, okay? And so that sweetness down the corner, if you maximize it at low percent extraction and low TDS. Okay, so this is one way of representing it, okay? But you can see there's kind of data overload still, even with this representation. And so what we thought is, like, how do we boil this all down to one poster? So I think everybody's seen the Coffee Tasters flavor wheel. There was actually a lot of really detailed statistics and analysis and lexicon development that went into it. A whole journal of food science article that went into it, and it boils down to a poster. And so a question we have is, like, how do we take all these data and boil it down to a poster? Okay, and so here's one possible representation. Okay, which is what we do is we take our coffee, the form of the coffee brewing control chart, and we give up on plotting exactly how the bitterness varies or the sourness. And what we do is just do a simple color mapping that indicates where specific sensory attributes are maximized. Okay, and so here on this one, and this is just me drawing it. So I'm an engineer, not an artist, so it might not look very beautiful yet. Okay, but this is the main idea. In the top left corner, just to drive home again, if you want to maximize your sour and citrusy profile of your coffee, go to the top left corner. Okay, and that, I want to emphasize, that doesn't mean that it's not sour anywhere else, but that's where you maximize it. Okay, if you want to maximize the bitter, smoky, roasted thing, you want to make something that'll be really good with a lot of cream and sugar, you want to go to that top right corner. Okay, if you're interested, as many specialty coffee people are, if you're interested in maximizing sweetness, and we have other data indicating that fruitiness is also maximized, then that you go down to that bottom left corner. We also have data, I didn't emphasize it here too much, we also have data indicating that tea, black tea, and kind of floral notes are maximized at high extraction and low TDS, so down in that bottom corner. So this is one possible way of representing all the complex data we're getting and boiling it down to help guide people with their brewing. Okay. One thing you'll note here, and like kind of the thing that people are really used to, the classic coffee brew control chart, they'll say, like, wait a second, where's the ideal box? Where's best? Okay. What I'd like to do is really drive home that all we're answering with the work I'm showing right here is, what does it taste like? And that doesn't say anything about what do people like. What something tastes like is very different from what people prefer to drink. Okay, and so I'm getting out of time here, but I'd like to just advertise 2 of my students' talks. Okay, and so towards that question of what is ideal, where should it be ideal? Okay, there's a talk tomorrow at noon Pacific time. Okay, by Andrew Cotter, and the title of the talk is "Investigating Consumer Preference for Black Coffee." Okay, And so he's got fascinating data. I'm not going to say anything about it except if you sell coffee for a living or if you love coffee, you'll definitely want to tune into that. The second talk, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be by Kinsey Batali. Okay, he's giving a talk on Saturday at 4 p.m. PST about the impact of brew temperature. Okay, everything I talked about today was all at constant brew temperature. Okay, right, and so she has really, really fascinating data showing how coffee brewing and the sensory qualities respond to brew temperature. So I strongly urge you to tune into those talks. Okay, and so I think I'm out of time. I'm looking forward to taking questions. Hopefully there's a whole bunch of cool questions. But first, let me just acknowledge things. And so I'm giving the talk, but none of this would have happened without Professor Jean-Xavier Guinard. He's a world famous, at least in sensory science circles, he's a world-class sensory scientist that I'm a chemical engineer. Everything I've learned about sensory science has been from him over the past couple of years. Okay. Scott Frost, or Dr. Scott Frost, was a postdoc who did the work on the RSMs. Okay. And then a large crowd of people have been helping. Kinsey, Andrew already mentioned. We have a whole team of different undergraduates and grad students helping with things. There's a long list here, okay, of different students that have helped. Okay. But just as a final comment, many thanks to the Coffee Science Foundation, and especially to Breville for underwriting it. Without Breville writing a very generous check to support the grad students in this research, none of it would have happened. And so with that, thanks for attention. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Applause. And so we do have some questions here. There's a lot. I don't think we will. I apologize. I don't feel like we're going to get to them all, but I'll get to them as well as I can. One of the questions came early in the presentation. It's from Lauren, who asks, are the numbers on the brewing control chart and the absorption ratio always fixed to each other? Is there a scenario where the absorption would change, but the brew doesn't change at the same level?
That's an excellent question. So the brew ratio, and gosh, I don't know how to go back, but the brew ratio, you control that, right? You control exactly how much water you put into the brewer and how much coffee grounds you put in. So that's totally independent. You can change that wherever you want to. The absorption ratio, I mentioned it's about 2. So that means you lose about 2 grams of water for every gram of coffee grounds you put in. That does vary a little bit with the grind size and the brewing technique. Our measurements show that it ranges between about 1.5 up to a maximum of about 3. Okay? And so there is a bit of variation there. And so you kind of control that with the grind size, but you have infinite flexibility about the brew ratio. Very good question.
Great. There was another question from Binny. Will sensory attributes of coffee ever become more quantitative, like how TDS shows a number?
That's a really good question. And so the effort you saw right here is kind of the cutting edge in terms of how do we make that happen. Okay. So the thing is that like when you like the TDS, that has a physical meaning, right? That's literally how much mass of dissolved coffee there is per mass of water. When you're saying how bitter is something, there's no absolute bitterness scale. It always has to be relative to something. And so here, to be as scientific and as kind of reproducible as possible, what we use is very specific bitterness references. And I forget exactly what we use here. I think it might be like a 0.5% caffeine solution or something like that. That everybody in the panel agrees, okay, that's what 100% bitterness is. And then we do calibration where we dope in decreasing amounts, and then we have everybody agree, oh, that's 50% bitter, that's 25% bitter. Examples, and they say, oh, that was kind of close to the 50% bitter, and that's the number they click on. Okay. In theory, if you publish all of your reference standards and all of your technique, you can have any descriptive analysis, any expert panel. If they tasted the same product anywhere around the world, they should get the same results. Okay. In theory, right? It's challenging though, right? And so I think that was a long-winded answer to say what I probably could have said more briefly, which is that like sensory is way harder, man. It's way harder to do sensory descriptive analysis and say what something tastes like than it is just to do a physical TDS measurement. Very good question.
There's a question from Marielle, which is, for homebrewers, is there a way to estimate TDS using accessible, i.e. non-scientific homebrewing tools?
Yes. If you have an oven, you can do a TDS measurement. It's challenging though, because to be precise, you need an analytical scale, right? So you need something that has better than 0.1 gram resolution for typical things. So the way you can measure TDS, right, is you take a cup of coffee, you brew it, okay, and you have your cup of coffee, stick the whole thing in the oven at 212, right? You wait a few hours or a couple days, depending on how big your cup of coffee is, right? And all the water evaporates, but all the dissolved solids stay behind, okay? And if you weighed the cup before you put coffee into it, and then you weigh the cup afterwards, then, and if you have the mass, you now know how many dissolved solids. We do that. We have precision analytical scales. We have ovens where we bake stuff to do that as a check against the way easier method, which is doing digital refractometry. Because you just take a little one little drip of your coffee, put it on the refractometer, and you get a measurement. I will say that you can get a really good digital refractometer for like $300 or $400. And so I know that's not a lot of people's price range, but if you can convince somebody to get one for you, you don't need any fancy software. All you need is that one equation that I showed you earlier in the talk. And if you measure the TDS, you can measure the percent extraction, know where you are on the coffee brewing control chart.
There were a couple questions about the coffee used and the roasts of it. Could you talk a little bit about whether was all the coffee roasted in one batch for all of these things for the different roast levels, and what were the roast levels and what was the coffee?
Yeah, very good questions. All those details are on our paper, which is in peer review at the Journal of Food Science. And so one thing I think I had on the acknowledgement slide, but I didn't highlight it, so I should take the opportunity now to highlight it, which is we did this research before Juliet Hahn came on board as our head roaster at the Coffee Center. And so we have a big thanks to Jen Apodaca. Some of you might know her. She helped roast it for us. We have the detailed roast information. And I think we have Actron scores. I don't remember them off the top of my head. They were wildly different roasts, okay? But we did take care to make sure that everything that was a light roast, it was all mixed together. And then we very carefully pulled a vacuum and froze it and then thawed it the day before so that we had the panel was tasting coffee that had gone through the same procedure, regardless of whether they tasted it towards the beginning of the panel or weeks later.
And great, thanks, Bill. And just to underscore something, all of these technical questions are answered in the academic articles that will be coming out. A series of them, we've already, as Bill mentioned, 2 have already come out. Another series of them will be coming out, and of course, the SCA also publishes plain language versions of these academic papers, which Bill and his colleagues are very generous in authoring for us. And so if you keep your eyes peeled on SCA publications, a lot of this information will be coming out in the coming weeks and months, and other resources. So the goal of the Specialty Coffee Association and the Coffee Science Foundation is to make all of this information available. Lectures is only one way that we do that. So keep your eye peeled for our publications, and we can answer lots of those questions. So with that, I just want to thank you, Bill. We're at the hour, and the webinar is going to stop soon. So I just want to thank you for your lecture today and your time.
No, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and thanks once again to Pacific Barista Series for their support here. And that's it for us. Thanks again. My name is Peter Giuliano, and on behalf of the Specialty Coffee Association, thanks everyone for coming.